all the weaknesses and problems that the United Nations has, it is the only really legitimate body of global governance. It's what people have as a reference. It's what everybody has in their minds. You know, if you remember, for example, the Star Wars movies, when you have those scenes of the Interplanetary Federation and so on, and all these humans and non-humans, inhabitants of the galaxy meet, that is modeled on the General Assembly of the United Nations. Even the physical way that it's being done. You know? So that means that even kids can understand that. And of course, the world is a very unequal place for a variety of reasons. And the G77 has this terrible task to represent the people that are more vulnerable or marginalized, and where many of them not even considered humans for a long time, and bring their concerns, their perspectives to the United Nations and to the global standard setting. And it represents the majority of humanity, and it represents more than 2/3 of the countries of the world. So it's a body with enormous responsibility, with very few resources, with very few conditions for research, for support. You sometimes see in international negotiations big country delegations on different issues, be that health or technology or education, and all the ambassadors from Europe or North America or whatever, they have plenty of advisors, and they can phone to think tanks and resources at home and so on. And our diplomats from developing countries are by themselves with tiny delegations and having to deal with trade negotiations in the morning and health in the afternoon and human rights conversation over the evening, which is really very, very difficult to cope. So we, on the one hand, try to bring them all the pressure and the hopes and the expectations of civil society in their own countries, which is a lot, and at the same time try to support them in the work that they do. So it's we have a dual relation with the G77, where on the one hand we channel aspirations from people within their own countries. Social Watch doesn't parachute in any country. We just collect and express the expression of citizens and civil society organizations from the country itself. But at the same time, we try to help them in understanding what is going on, the impact, the global negotiations, what is the landscape, and try to assist in different ways to bring out the best of the positions to the global decision-making bodies, particularly at the UN. Well, if we take just recently, last week, the G77 in China, they really managed to have an influence over the Sustainable Development Goals that have just been approved, and over many other negotiation processes. What we need to understand is that UN is a complicated animal in a way, because when people think of an assembly or the General Assembly, they think of a parliament. They think, oh, this is some kind of a world parliament. And in any parliament, a majority votes, and what the majority wants is what is being done. Now, the G77 is a 2/3 majority of the General Assembly, so it's 133 votes out of 193. So in a way, anything that the G77 decides that is to be done has an automatically overwhelming 2/3 majority in the United Nations. But, and that is the big but, then you have to implement the resolutions. And in the United Nations, implementations depends on the Security Council, where 5 countries have veto power, and it depends on money that the G77 doesn't have. So what the G77 very early decided in all the discussions that somehow relate with the social and economic aspects is we are not going to vote. We are not going to use that majority that we have. We are going to reach consensus, because if we don't reach consensus, then it's useless, because no matter how big the majority is, we cannot impose. The UN doesn't have the capacity to impose by force its resolutions, except through the Security Council, where the G77 has no power at all. So there is the negotiation process starting within the group itself, and then with the others, and then trying to convince and trying to reach a consensus. And this is something that sometimes for the public is very hard to understand, as to why did you accept this and why my positions didn't come through, even if the G77 has adopted them. Because the whole thing is we need that consensus for anything to get done. And even so, many resolutions that have been approved by consensus or by unanimity, then they are not being implemented. And that, of course, creates a bad climate when people start to suspect the good faith of the interlocutor that they have in front of them. Well, out of the summit in Santa Cruz a couple of weeks ago, the G77 approved a very ambitious platform, the Santa Cruz Declaration. 50 years ago, when the group was created, it was all about trade and industrialization. And at that moment, the thinking was, we do like the rich countries did, we will get industrialized, developed, and that's what we need to do. And we need some help in doing that faster. And that would be all. It was already a complicated agenda at that time, nevertheless, because of all the constraints, the history of colonialism, the capacities, and the rules, the global rules that are biased against the poor countries. But now the agenda is much more complicated, because now there is a recognition that we have planetary boundaries. And not every person in the world can have the 1 or 2 cars per family, as some countries have, because then we cannot breathe. And since the planet has limits, the issues become issues of fairness and justice, and how do we achieve well-being? What does development mean? It doesn't mean anymore to do like the rich countries did. It means in our days that both the rich and the poor countries have to change. The rich because they are over-consuming on their share of the world resources, and the poor countries because they are completely under-consuming, and people are starving, people are hungry, people are dying for curable diseases. So we need to create a new development paradigm for everybody. And that is the global challenge, and that is what is new in the agenda for the future of the G77, but of all of the world.